The 1950s were the seedbed of the vast social change that would take place in the 60s and 70s. It was also a time of great prosperity for most in America, a time when only one person working could afford to buy a house and a car for their family. It was the era when youth culture came of age, the birth of rock and roll, and the explosion of television. With low mortgage rates available through the GI Bill, the demand for individual family homes exploded. Suburbs expanded quickly, and they began to follow a path set out in Levittown, New York, which was the first planned suburb. The company went in, bought a tract of land, divided it into house lots, put in streets and sewers, and built spec houses that people could buy at a rate that was affordable. This was the beginning of the way most neighborhoods are built today, tract houses, where the company goes in, builds a house, and people buy that house in a planned neighborhood. They put in their own landscaping, their own shrubs, and have an affordable individual house. This all grew out of the experiment that was Levittown. World War II had brought about many technological advancements, including miniaturization, and these were transformed to commercial spending after the war. For example, this compact radio. If you remember the picture of the radio we saw in the 1920s, it was a whole big piece of furniture. But now you could buy a radio that you could unplug and carry from room to room without any problem. The demand for consumer products zoomed. Among those products were televisions. Television had been invented in the 1920s, but it was not a commercial product until after World War II. And during the 1950s, you saw the heyday of television with the development of the networks, national advertising, and shows for the entire family. I don't know if any of you have ever seen a rotary telephone. After World War II, the demand for telephone service expanded to the point where by the end of the 1950s, most households had one phone, not multiple phones, one phone. And they looked like this. You would dial the number by putting your finger in the hole next to the number that you wanted and spinning it around. Now, telephone service was spotty at first after the war. Some people had to use what were called party lines, where you would have 4 or 5 different households have the same number, but each household had a different ring so they could know who was being called. It was a little bit lacking in privacy because you could pick up and listen to your neighbor's conversation. As the GIs came home from the war, they celebrated, and almost immediately you had the beginning of what became known as the baby boom. Beginning in 1946, American families increased virtually every year. One Englishman said it seemed like every woman he saw had a baby in her arm and 2 in a stroller. This was the beginning of what would become the youth culture. These are also the young people that will make up the revolution of the 1960s and 70s. With the baby boom came demand for baby goods, for children's goods, and so American business jumped in to fill the need. For the first time in history, American business began to market to children and young people, thus beginning the youth movement. They would bring about fads like this hula hoop so that every kid wanted one and parents would buy. This explosion of children necessitated new schools, new teachers. And so the public school systems were expanding incredibly fast to try to meet the demand of the baby boom. Television began to make shows about the nuclear family, the wife, the husband, and the children. As you could probably tell by the name of this show, Father Knows Best, it was about the father. You notice the wife has her apron on. She has just finished preparing breakfast for the family. The husband is about to go off to work, and the children are just about to go off to school. The wife then stays at home, takes care of the house, and begins to prepare the evening meal when the family will all come together once again and sit down and have a meal together. However, from the name, you know what the plot of most of the shows was. Somebody in the family has a problem. One of the kids, maybe the wife. So say one of the sons wants to ask a girl out on a date, but he doesn't know how. Well, where does he turn? He turns to his father, because father knows best. And so the theme of these kinds of shows was the man of the house had the answers. The woman of the house was supposed to be the good wife. As it shows in this list of how to be a good wife from a woman's magazine in the 1950s, the role of women had not really changed that much. Things like a wife should always know her place. She should be waiting happily to see him when he gets home. Things like this. In the 1950s, these were the expectations of what a proper woman's role was. Like Father Knows Best, the Ozzie and Harriet TV show that was very popular featured a family, husband, wife, and 2 sons. However, Ozzie and Harriet brought us something new to American culture, the tween idol. Long before Britney Spears, there was little Ricky Nelson, seen here on the right. On the Ozzie and Harriet show, they would feature him sitting in his room playing his guitar and singing a song. And the tweens just went nuts for little Ricky Nelson. He went on to become a famous rock and roll star with his own band. But this is the beginning of catering to teen culture, to the youth culture, the building of what we know today as programming, advertising, and lifestyles, not for adults, but for teenagers. Television became the central factor of family life in many cases. The entire family would gather around the TV and watch all the shows together. There was no real programming for anything but the whole family, except for Saturday morning cartoons. And so here you see the family gathered around in the evening to watch their television shows, but look who is controlling which shows they watch. This is just reinforcing the man as the head of the house. And this was the image, this was the notion that media was projecting as to how the American family should live. But as the baby boomers grew into their teen years, and those children born during the war became teenagers, they began to want to find places where they could congregate without the parents. And so one of the famous places to gather was the local soda fountain. At most drugstores during this time, they had a place where they would serve soft drinks, floats, milkshakes, things like that. It was called the soda fountain. And so many times this would be the social gathering place for teenagers outside the house, where they could talk about the issues of their day without having to share it with the entire family. Another place that was popular with teenagers to hang out was the malt shop. Think of this as a locally owned Dairy Queen. And so the teenagers would gather here to socialize. You'll notice what is behind these teenage girls. A jukebox, probably playing rock and roll. Chuck Berry, in his famous song School Days, talks about going after school, going around the corner to the shop, going and throw a nickel in the jukebox, and then they start to rock. Another popular social hangout out of the house for the teenagers of the 1950s. Another popular hangout for teenagers was the drive-in. Think of a Sonic, except where they want you to stay. They're not telling you stay in your car. And so teenagers would drive up to the drive-in, maybe order a Coke or a burger or something like that, and spend the evening moving from car to car, socializing. This is also a good example of what grew in the 1950s as the American car culture. For teenagers, it was fairly easy to get a car because there were a lot of older cars that they could buy fairly cheaply and fix up themselves. Cars were not that mechanically difficult during this time. And so the whole thing of cruising Main Street, of hanging out at the drive-in, of living life in your car, that begins with the teenagers of the 1950s. A part of this growing car culture was the drive-in movie. I don't know if any of you have ever been to a drive-in movie, but you sit in your car and you put a speaker on the window of the car and watch the movie from your car. Now, whole families could go to the drive-in, and they did. But for teenagers, it was also called the passion pit, because this is where you could maybe get in the back seat and do a little hugging and kissing. A lot of times the teenagers would park towards the back, away from the families. But this is just another illustration of the growing car culture in the 1950s. One of the movies that became hugely popular with young people was James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause. The character is antisocial. He smokes, he drinks, he doesn't play by the rules, he drives fast. And many teenagers found this vicariously thrilling. Not that they were going to run out and do the same things, although some of them did. But remember, their parents are the greatest generation. They're the ones who lived through the Great Depression and World War II. They'd had enough excitement in their life. They basically just wanted to go home after work, watch a little TV, maybe have a barbecue in the backyard on the weekend. And that was not horribly appealing to teenagers. And so the youth of the day began to look for ways to, maybe without having to break the rules, still live with the fantasy of, oh, wouldn't it be cool to be like James Dean? Another such anti-hero was Marlon Brando in a movie called The Wild Ones, where he was the leader of an outlaw motorcycle gang. Oh, wouldn't it be cool, rather than having to hang out with your parents at the weekend barbecue, to get on your motorcycle and go out and raise some hell? There were enough young people acting out that they began to concern their parents' generation. They were labeled juvenile delinquents, and they were to be put into their place. The Blackboard Juggle was a movie about juvenile delinquents, but in it, the teacher takes control of these juvenile delinquents and forces them to obey. So you have the idea of the older generation still in control of young people. And more young people are beginning to question whether that's the way things should be. Part of this growing restlessness among young people can be seen in the music. Their parents were listening to the pop stars of the day. The Pat Boones, the Perry Comos, the Frank Sinatras, that sort of thing. And teenagers were not that big on this kind of music. And so they began to buy records that better reflected what they liked. And those records came to be known as rock and roll. This is Bill Haley and the Comets, who had the first breakout rock and roll hit called Rock Around the Clock. And the teenagers loved it and began buying more and more of this rock and roll. Now, one of the interesting things about rock and roll is their parents, for the most part, didn't like it. There were ministers who held services to condemn rock and roll and held bonfires where people were supposed to come and bring their rock and roll records and burn them. This was seen as the devil's music of the 1950s, just like jazz had been in the 1920s. But the teenagers kept buying the music. Another interesting fact about the beginnings of rock and roll is that the name of it was made up by a disc jockey by the name of Alan Freed. He wanted to play rhythm and blues, but rhythm and blues was known as black music and therefore was not acceptable on white radio stations. So he simply took a phrase from rhythm and blues that actually was a reference to sex, and he began calling the music rock and roll. And because it was over the radio, nobody could see whether the artists were white or black, and so he began to play rhythm and blues under the heading rock and roll. One of the early rock and roll heroes was a young man from Lubbock, Texas, named Buddy Holly. He had grown up on country and western music, but he began to write songs that were country but had a rock and roll beat. And so rock and roll in many ways was a fusion called rockabilly of this hillbilly music and black music. The record industry quickly saw the market for rock and roll among teenagers. And they began to produce music in a format that was completely new. It was called the 45 record. It was one song on each side. And you could have a little record player that teenagers could take back in their bedroom and play their rock and roll and would not be disturbing their parents. And so the youth market begins to drive not just the music business, but also the equipment business. As I mentioned, rhythm and blues was seen as black music and therefore not suitable for white audiences. And so white artists began to make what were called cover records. They would take a rhythm and blues song and record it in a pop style. By clicking on these two links, you can hear the difference between the original Little Richard recording of Tutti Frutti and the white version sung by Pat Boone. It was singing rhythm and blues songs that made Elvis famous. Most of his early recordings were old rhythm and blues songs that he made into rock and roll. And because he was white, they became acceptable to most white audiences. Not all, but most. And you can hear his version of the same song, Tutti Frutti, by clicking on the link. Even as the youth of America were struggling to establish their own identity separate from their parents were giving in to a mass hysteria about the spread of communism. This was aided by politicians such as Joseph McCarthy, who used fear of communism to gain power. This was particularly true after the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, because now more and more Americans came to fear a nuclear war that would wipe out mankind. Politicians played on this, and it led to what became known as the era of McCarthyism. Joseph McCarthy was a little-known senator from Wisconsin who was looking to get reelected, but he hadn't done much in the Senate that would get him reelected. He was looking for a campaign issue, and he decided on anti-communism. So at a speech, he stood up and said he had a list of hundreds of workers in the United States government who were communist spies and saboteurs. In reality, the pieces of paper he held up were blank. He didn't have a list. But that set off a frenzy in searching for saboteurs, for spies, and for sympathizers to communism, and exposing them, getting them expelled from their jobs, getting them put on blacklists where they could not find employment. All of this was the hysteria created by Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy used his growing power as the leading advocate for anti-communism to smear mud on anyone who disagreed with him. Thus, there was no free speech, because if you dared to speak out against what McCarthy was doing, he would label you a communist. And that could cost you your job, your friends, even your family. This famous cartoon shows how he pushed the Republican Party into this campaign of slinging mud at anyone who stood up and disagreed with them. In the mass hysteria that swept the United States, fearing communism, it threatened to take away civil rights of all Americans. Free speech. You could not speak out against those in power for fear of being labeled a communist, even if you weren't. McCarthy became so powerful that he forced through Congress a loyalty oath that had to be taken by all government employees. And if a government employee was found to have lied, then they could be sentenced to prison. So it was basically no one had free speech. No one had the ability to stand up to Joseph McCarthy. Everyone in the government had to remain silent. Of course, this hysteria caused an attack on individual civil rights. Anyone who opposed what the government was doing or what was the normal course of action was labeled a potential communist. Thus, when Dr. Martin Luther King, for example, stood up against the status quo of segregation, he was believed to be a communist, or at least communist-inspired. And this is one of the things that will help lead to the civil rights movement. It is interesting that for all of the Senate hearings that Joseph McCarthy held, he did not find one communist. He was not able to convict one person as a spy or a saboteur of the Soviet Union. However, another politician that had used many of McCarthy's tactics, a young congressman and then senator from California named Richard Nixon, was a little more successful. In the Alger Hiss case, he was able to prove that Alger Hiss, not that he was a spy, but that he had committed perjury by lying about whether or not he was a communist. Nixon did this because under oath, Hiss was asked, "Have you ever been a member of a communist organization?" He replied, "No." But Richard Nixon found out that he had been a part of a book club while he was at Harvard. And in that book club, they had read communist literature. That was enough. And Alger Hiss was convicted not of spying, but of perjury. The threat from the Soviet Union was ramped up even more in 1957 when they became the first country to launch a man-made object into space. It was called SPUTNIK, the first satellite. They had gotten the atomic bomb. Now they seemed to be beating the United States into space. It seemed like the Soviet Union was rushing ahead of the United States in technology. This caused a super panic among the politicians who began to enforce school regulations requiring more and more math and science, in the belief that we were falling behind in science and technology, and therefore it needed to be a greater emphasis in schools. For example, I'm not sure what the highest level of mathematics was that you had to get your high school diploma. But in Virginia, in the late 50s, every student who got a high school diploma had to pass at least trig. That's how much they had ramped up the qualifications. Every student had to take lab sciences. And so Sputnik and the fear of falling behind technologically changed American school policies. The fear of atomic warfare was real. The United States feared that the Soviet Union would drop atomic bombs on the United States. This was long before missiles. The bombs had to be delivered by airplanes. And so the government put out this video. I want you to imagine that you're in grade school, say 5th, 6th grade, something like that. And you're called to an assembly. And the principal gets up there on the stage and says, boys and girls, we have a video from your government that tells you what to do in case of an emergency. Pay close attention because this could happen and you need to be prepared. And then they played this video. After seeing Duck and Cover, then maybe you arrive home that afternoon and your parents have started building a bomb shelter in your backyard. As a child, what does this mean? It probably means that the adults believe that an atomic attack is going to happen. Not might happen, is going to happen. And we have to be prepared. And so the fear of a nuclear war was brought home to a whole generation of students, of baby boomers. And they will carry that forward into the 1960s and 70s. And one of the reasons that many of the baby boomers will become anti-war advocates is this fear of atomic war. So as we came to the end of the 1950s, most Americans had a set of beliefs. I want you to read through these beliefs and see how many of them still exist today. The belief in the sanctity and legitimacy of our leaders. The belief in gradual change. The belief that our economy, our military, and our morality are superior to any country in the world. The belief that third world nations like South America, Africa, the Middle East, were not important in world affairs. Other beliefs that most Americans held entering the 1960s were that the environment and natural resources were limitless, that technology could solve any major problem, and that young people, as had all previous generations, would quietly move through school and climb the ladder to the middle class. Finally, most Americans believed that the United States was exceptional and was a role model for the rest of the world. Now, I want you to consider how many of these beliefs do Americans still hold today? How many of them have become discarded? And so we are going to consider, as we move into talking about the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, why these beliefs changed. Why most of them are not beliefs that Americans hold today.